Everyone loves tips and advice, but where do you get advice that you can trust? Well, one of the things I try to do with my video blog is to give parents important tips and advice that can help them be more successful with their children. This week on the Just 7 Steps podcast, I will share some of the best tips and advice shared on my blog over this past half year. So get pen and paper out and start taking notes this week on Just 7 Steps. Hi, I'm Robert Schramm, a behavior analyst, education specialist, author, and dad. And each week I share strategies to help you find a path to real progress for your kids who may be struggling. Today on the podcast, I'll be presenting to you some of the best tips and advice that I've shared over the past half year on my video blog. So without further ado, here's my first clip covering 5 tips avoiding bad behavior in your kids. Your kids are bound to make mistakes. This is just part of growing up. But there's a big difference between making a mistake and choosing to use what a parent might consider bad behavior. If your goal is to be able to avoid as much of this bad behavior in your kids as possible, you will need to follow a few simple but basic rules. I follow these rules as part of the 7 Steps to Instructional Motivation that I teach parents and professionals around the globe, as well as use in my own home with my 2 daughters, Zoe and Lainey. So here you go. My top 5 rules for avoiding bad behavior in your kids. Number 1, have the ability to control access to your child's most important things. That doesn't mean deprive them of anything, but set up your environment so that you can control when or how much of these things that they can have. If you can control access to it, you can use it as a reason why they would more regularly choose better behavior. It won't stop honest mistakes, but it puts you in the position you need to be in to be able to affect their choice of using bad behavior. Number 2, prove to your kids that you are more fun and offer more value than you do work. Try not to let yourself be seen as a punisher or someone who only takes things away and takes their good behavior for granted. Work 3 positive comments into any conversation where you're going to have to correct or critique them. And number 3, don't give your kids instructions that you know they are likely not to want to follow. This means break down your instructions into smaller, more manageable chunks. And whenever possible, wait for moments of motivation where your child wants something from you before you give them your instruction. This will make sure they have the highest amount of motivation before you ask something of them. The better you do rule number 1 and are in control of their most important things, the more they will come to you with requests that would then motivate your instructions. Number 4, give lots of attention to the positive behavior you see. Show them that you are more interested in and more affected emotionally by their positive behavior choices than their bad ones. The more attention and access to their favorite things you can give them after good choices, and the less likely you are to give them attention for negative behavior, the more they will want to use those positive choices for you and for themselves. And number 5, the final short, helpful rule for getting your kids to stop using bad behavior is don't offer too much additional reinforcement for the bad behavior when you see it. Correct bad behavior as you need to, but don't get emotional and angry. Don't yell and show them that it affects you. Just carefully and calmly start to reduce the types of access they have to their most important things, the ones that you took control of in rule number 1. Again, this is just a short video blog with a quick answer to what can be a very complicated question. But if your goal is to start being able to avoid bad behavior in your kids, starting to focus on these 5 rules will give you the jumping off point that you need. Next up, I talk a bit about how to discipline your children. I personally don't like the term discipline and prefer to consider the use of consequences as a process of teaching, but you can see how I covered that in this following blog post. So, what is discipline? And how do I answer how to discipline your kids without causing more damage to a relationship with your child? Well, first thing we have to do is define discipline. According to Google definitions, discipline is the practice of training people to obey rules or a code of behavior using punishment to correct disobedience. And that's an ugly definition. I mean, this can't really be what parents are asking me. I mean, we want our kids to learn to follow important rules and some standards of behavior, but is it our goal to punish and correct disobedience? I mean, what is disobedience anyway? Do we want children who only obey? I'd argue a more logical definition for discipline is how do we correct mistakes and help our kids to make better choices? Can we agree to go with this one, please? So if we define discipline as correcting mistakes and helping kids to make better choices, there's actually a lot we can do to discipline our children. And some of the ways we have to choose from are certainly better than others. Here are a few ways how to discipline your children that I would use and a couple I would work hard to avoid. First, let's cover ways how to discipline your children that you should use. Stay calm and remind them of the rules they've broken or that they've used bad behavior. And if possible, give them a chance to immediately fix their mistake with little to no consequence, should they make the fix without complaint the first time. Stay calm and ask them why they might have broken the rule or used that bad behavior. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation you should be willing to hear. Stay calm and find a measured response that is meaningful, but a short-term response that involves losing something of value or the removal of access to a preferred item. Stay calm and be ready to return access as soon as you are again seeing behavior that you'd want to reinforce. If your child escalates behavior during the removal process, stay calm and wait out their disapproval before giving them any chances to change their situation. And then when they return to calm, begin looking for things they can do to return access to their favorite things. The bottom line is, no matter what, find a way to stay calm. Now, let's cover ways how to discipline your children that I would avoid. Yelling at them, nagging them, embarrassing or belittling them, hitting them, spanking them, giving additional workload to pay them back for mistakes they made. The bottom line is this: anything you do to take away from their environment after bad behavior or broken rules is better than anything you would add to their environment. Take away attention, don't add yelling. Take away a toy, don't add spanking. Take away an opportunity, don't give them additional work. If you need to discipline your kids, do it with removals. Anything you take away can always be given back. Anything you add, like yells and hits, belittling statements, cannot truly ever be undone. Another topic we covered in the blog this year was how to handle sensory issues. I know an amazing young lady who is in her early teen years who has a disorder called misophonia. Misophonia is sometimes called selective sound sensitivity syndrome. It is a syndrome in which the person is particularly triggered with negative feelings and an immediate fight or flight response to what most people would consider normal everyday sounds. Most people with misophonia deal with sensitivities to sounds related to breathing or chewing, but some sensitivities to certain singing voices or even traffic sounds is also possible, among others. When someone has misophonia, they have an oversensitivity or a severe negative reaction to these specific sounds. Imagine if every time you sat down to eat, each person at the table pulled out a chalkboard and began scratching their nails down that chalkboard throughout the duration of the meal. Well, this is what it can feel like to someone with misophonia. Imagine trying to eat a meal happily with that happening, or take an exam in school, or even listen to your teacher when the boy with the cold next to you is scratching the chalkboard over and over again. Not all sensory issues are going to be related to sounds. People can have visual sensitivities to light. People can have tactile sensitivities to certain textures or materials. And there can be taste and texture-related sensitivities in food, as well as those related to motion. Any one of our children's senses can be affected by what someone might call a sensory sensitivity and may cause you to wonder how to handle sensory issues. When your goal is to help your child to live their happiest, most successful life, you have a lot to consider in determining how to handle these sensory issues. The biggest issue is when the concepts of happy and successful clash. A child with a sensory issue can be happiest when they're getting the right amount of that sensory input. This could mean more or less of something than what might be expected. If our only goal was to make our kids happy, then we could just rearrange the environment around them to assure that they have as much access to this optimal level of sensory input as possible. But what are we supposed to do when our child's happiness and their success may, in some cases, be mutually exclusive? A successful diet includes certain levels of vitamins and minerals, as well as a combination of food types. But what if the only thing that makes your child happy is eating French fries? And getting them to eat anything else than that makes them unhappy. A successful level of activity in a school classroom is usually limited to being able to remain seated for stretches of time. It might include not responding vocally to stimuli that might otherwise be fun to respond to, or it could include maintaining close proximity to people who make you uncomfortable or bother your senses in some way. The bottom line is, what do we do as parents when what makes our children happy also makes them less successful, and vice versa? Well, this is the question I've been asking and that we've been asking in the autism education world for many years, as these types of sensory issues are quite commonly found among autistic individuals. Parents who are neurotypical understand the complexity of social norms and often want their children to benefit from the same types of social understanding that they have. This means that in some situations, behaving or acting like everyone else to fit in. And sensory issues can often cause children to behave or act in ways that might be socially less appropriate or even unacceptable in some settings. For instance, the child with misophonia I mentioned earlier gets anxious and then eventually gets upset when people she's in close proximity with breathe heavily through their nose or smack their lips. She will get up, she will ask them to go away, and she often can't even eat with her family. Now, it's natural for parents to worry about their kids and want to help them to avoid disappointment and any emotional pain. So it's not uncommon for parents to want to find ways to eliminate their child's sensory issues if they can. Some sensory issues can certainly be worked on. Improvement can happen, and some can even be eliminated over time. But there are some important factors that come into play in determining if eliminating or reducing sensitivities is likely or even possible. And there are factors that might determine whether or not it is even appropriate to try. Firstly, you have to consider the sensory issue itself. Is it something that doesn't harm the child or anyone else physically? If so, maybe it's not an important consideration. If it's not harming the child or anyone else, and the child can continue to react to this sensory issue in ways that do not cause any harm, maybe it's not a worthwhile goal to target. Next, you need to see if the sensory issue is causing any other delays or detriment to the child's ability to learn or develop the skills they will need to be happy long term. In this instance, we're looking to see if the child who might be reacting to a sensory preference in the moment is able to continue to make reasonable progress on other important goals, or does the reaction to this sensitivity interfere with their growth and eventual happiness? For example, if a child is bothered by other people eating, but they can continue to grow and learn and develop important skills throughout the day, well, then it likely isn't as concerning of an issue. However, if the child's sensory issue is that they want to be rocking back and forth with their eyes closed and humming songs, and this behavior is desired strongly enough that the child is doing it throughout their day, not being able to stop to focus on other important things, it might make it more appropriate of a goal for us to target. Another consideration is how strongly the child feels that need or desire to engage in the activities related to that sensory issue. On a scale of 1 to 10, where would you and your child rate their compulsion or desire to engage in that activity? The lower the number, the more likely you will be able to put into place a successful plan to help reduce it. A child who is feeling a desire less than 5 probably can avoid the behavior related to it enough to learn and probably wouldn't need our help. If they are a 5 to an 8, it might be a good target for us as the child is bothered by it, perhaps the feeling of it, but they may have the ability to control their reaction and could benefit from some of the strategies that I will discuss next. Now, if the child is feeling that desire at a 9 or a 10. It might be so strong that any attempt at this time to reduce or eliminate the behavior related to that sensory issue might be too fraught with unhappiness and pushback to be successful at this point. Probably the most important aspect of deciding if a sensory issue should be worked on by adults is if the child themselves wants to change the behavior or the sensitivity and cannot do it without your help. There are those who would argue that unless the child wants to make the change, you shouldn't be focusing on it. Now, I can't quite go that far personally, but I do believe that anytime you are determining what to help a child with, working on things they want to work on is certainly the best place to start. Once you're able to determine if a sensory issue is one that makes sense to address, meaning that it is in some way dangerous or harmful to the child or others, it is creating other important delays that are likely to harm the child's future happiness, and the behavior is currently in a range of importance to the child that success could be reasonably expected. Then you can consider a few options to try to address these issues. First, give the child access to the sensory desire at times it can be available so that they're not feeling deprived of it at times when you want to work on reducing it. If the child likes physical activities or massage or tickles or even joint compressions, certain types of foods or textures, you want to make these things available to the child when they can enjoy them without problem or detriment. If there are serious social concerns, perhaps you make these things available in locations of the home that are more private or less socially dependent. Teaching a child to wait for privacy for certain behaviors is a part of growing up for every child. It can certainly be part of the education related to how to handle sensory issues. Second, consider which of these sensory issues might be able to act as reinforcement for other behavior. If a child is strongly motivated to have or do certain things, these items or activities would likely act as strong reinforcement. And rather than working to try to reduce their value to the child, we just use them for their value that they offer us as reinforcement for other behavior that they would need to learn or activities they should be participating in. If your child loves jumping on the trampoline and the bed and the couch and on your lap, then in addition to giving this for free at times, that it's not detrimental to them, use it as a reinforcer by allowing it and making it more fun when you do it together after they've demonstrated good behavior choices. Through the behavioral principle of pairing, these good choices they've made will likely increase because of their relationship to the preferred stimulus. And because the stimulus is being paired with things that the child might consider work, the items they enjoy that are problematic will likely reduce naturally as well. Third, for sensory issues that are not beneficial for their reinforcing value, but instead relate to escape from uncomfortable or even irritating situations, you might be able to organize a program of desensitization. This is slowly building up a tolerance in careful but meaningful ways to the sensory issue over time. However, I would recommend saving this approach for when you are working with a professional who understands the ins and outs of how to run it safely and correctly. And again, the best bet for this type of sensory issue is not necessarily to try to change it, but rather to help the child learn how to cope with the environment in ways that allow them to avoid and, if necessary, respond to the triggers when they occur without using behavior that makes them worse or makes things worse for them or anyone else involved. I'd like to finish this show on tips and advice off with a blog I did on parenting advice that you should ignore. This is a list of some bad advice I've seen given to parents that really doesn't offer any meaningful value or at worst can harm a child long-term. Additionally, to some of my best advice, this last clip also offers you one of my most colorful shirts. Enjoy. You can find tips and tricks and hints and advice for just about anything on the internet these days. And long before the internet, you could get the same tips, tricks, hacks, and recommendations from friends and family, or even the local bookstore. Unfortunately, not all advice is going to be good, and not everyone offering advice is truly qualified to do so. I can't tell you the number of places I've seen parenting advice come from people who have no education or experience beyond that of raising their own children. Sure, being a parent is helpful in understanding the daily struggles and some of the trials and tribulations of parenting, but does it really make you an expert? I have two daughters, both of whom I count as my experience raising kids. But in addition to these two young, typically developing girls, I have also directly worked with thousands of children with just about every possible diagnosis out there. Additionally, I have a master's degree in special education. I have worked as a certified teacher and passed advanced coursework and a written test to become a board certified behavior analyst. This certification requires that I maintain a high level of continuing education, as well as regarding the latest research and ethical concerns. And I've been board certified for just under 20 years. All of this gives me a unique perspective that allows me to filter my advice, tips, and recommendations through a large body of research and experience. I can't imagine if I was trying to advise people on parenting based on just my own experiences with Zoe and Lainey, my two daughters. Or even if I was trying to advise people in a larger scheme based on just my experiences with the first 100 kids I'd worked with. So for me, it's very worrisome when people become parenting experts based on how they successfully raised their family of 4. But beyond an expert's qualification, what's more concerning is the types of advice that sometimes get shared. So today I'm going to share with you my top 3 parenting tips that harm your child. And here we go. Tip number 1. Tip 1 is a tip that I hear all the time. It is certainly a parenting tip that will harm your child. This tip is to avoid using reinforcement. When someone recommends that you avoid using reinforcement, I immediately know that they have no formal behavioral education and have no real idea of what reinforcement truly is. My guess is that by saying avoid reinforcement, what they mean is to avoid promising reinforcers or to make deals or bribes up front before getting a behavior. But unfortunately, anyone who knows what reinforcement is can tell you that that's not reinforcement. Reinforcement can only happen after a behavior and not before. And therefore, bribes, deals, and promises are not reinforcement. If someone is telling you not to use reinforcement and they truly mean not to allow reinforcement to follow behavior that you want to see more of, then they have no understanding of reinforcement, because something is only described as a reinforcer because of the effect it has on behavior. And that effect is that it increases it. Therefore, anything at all that happens after a behavior and increases that behavior in the future is a reinforcer. So it's impossible to not use reinforcement. Any behavior that is happening more and more is being reinforced. You just are not in control of it, and therefore you can't use it to benefit your child's development. The final option for people who say don't use reinforcement is perhaps someone who is meaning to say don't use external or extrinsic reinforcement and only use natural or intrinsic reinforcers. Now, if this is the case, this is not necessarily bad advice, because anytime you can count on natural reinforcers to increase behavior you want to see more of, this would be a preferred method. But the problem is, so much of the behavior you want your child to engage in doesn't offer meaningful intrinsic reinforcement. Therefore, what these people end up doing is, instead of offering any positive reinforcement at all, in an attempt to not use extrinsic reinforcement, what they end up doing is using what's called negative reinforcement. And negative reinforcement is something I strongly recommend against using, because in most situations, it's the process of making yourself an annoyance to the child up front, and then just removing your annoyance as the reinforcer when the behavior occurs. In actuality, because this person does not want to give a reward for doing a behavior, they instead choose to nag the child or make themselves an aversive, and then just stop being the annoyance as the reinforcement. So bottom line is, no learning takes place without reinforcement. Principally, this is a fact. So if anyone tells you to avoid using reinforcement as a blanket piece of advice, I recommend you run for the nearest door, because this person has no behavioral education to support them and is just giving advice that is one of the several common parenting tips that can harm your child. Another parenting tip that can actually harm your child is don't ever punish your kids. Again, similar to reinforcement, part of this comes from a misunderstanding of what the term punishment means. If what this person actually means is don't hit, yell at, or embarrass, or maybe lock your child in a closet, then yes, this would be good advice. But when they say don't punish your kids, You are behaviorally rejecting a ton of reactions to behavior that might not only be helpful, but may end up being necessary in some situations. When someone says don't punish your child, it usually means not to focus on the negatives and to try to talk to them and evoke in them a desire to do better through reason. But this is a fine goal to have. But for so many parents and so many children, growing up without any form of limit setting or boundaries is damaging to a child's ability to successfully navigate the social world. I know children who've grown up in a consequence-free household where behavior is never punished in any form, and parents try to talk their children into making better choices. And more often than not, these children grow up without a healthy understanding of the social consequences, and they find themselves struggling just even to navigate the greater social world outside of the family. You can't teach most children to make better choices without some combination of reinforcement for making those better choices and some form of boundary or limit setting related to the negative choices they might make. The complexity of how to do this best is a challenge for even the seasoned behavior analyst. But the idea that someone can give you a blanket, don't ever punish your kids advice tells me that they're very naive about what punishment is or how to set boundaries, or they're just unable to create healthy limits for their kids in meaningful ways. For example, if your child were to bop another child on the head and take their toy, would you consider it inappropriate to take that toy back and give it to the child who was bopped? You would technically be using a form of punishment. If you asked your child to do their homework and you found them on their phone and you took their phone away until the homework was done, guess what? You've just used a form of punishment. To try to tell a parent that these consequences would be wrong at all costs would invariably leave that family with very little in the way of consequences that can help set limits and create healthy boundaries for their children. So of course, these tipsters might say, well, instead of setting limits this way, just explain to your child that hitting is hurtful and that the other child will be unhappy, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, you can and should do this as well. But what happens when you've done this and your kid just keeps on bopping? Limit setting is going to become important to some degree in almost all parenting relationships. And I would not be comfortable taking the advice of someone who says, don't ever punish your kids, because they obviously don't know the many different forms of reduction techniques available to them and likely cannot support you in setting healthy limits with your children. The third and final one of my parenting tips that harm your children relates to spanking or paddling a child. I'm actually a member of a very popular parenting group on Facebook, and there are several parenting coaches in the group who actually advocate for what they call light paddling or spanking of children when they break house rules. This is likely the parenting tip that is the most likely to do harm to an individual child. Although, as I mentioned earlier, we need to become gifted at knowing how and when to reinforce and even offer limits and boundaries to behavior. There really is never a reason or a benefit to hitting a child that outweighs the possible negative effects hitting can cause. It has become quite clear in all recent research that children who are hit by their parents are more likely to lash out physically against others and more likely to distance themselves from their parents as they grow. The last thing you want to do to your child is teach them that violence is an acceptable response to not getting your needs met in a loving relationship. I love you, so I have to hit you is an archaic way of thinking that I would have hoped was no longer a part of any parent's repertoire. Now, I do understand that some children are more challenging than others, and it may be harder to find meaningful consequences for some children that help to set limits. But if you've resorted to hitting, you've given up on building a more positive reciprocal parenting relationship and determined that physical dominance is all you have to work with. It's only a matter of time before your physical threats no longer work or your child decides that they just don't want to be around you anymore. There is a reason that physical violence, even loving spankings, are outlawed in many countries. They're not a necessary tool and should not be a part of what you want to do as a parent. If you have someone advising you to spank or paddle your kids, you need to reconsider if this person is actually someone who can help you, because they are offering you a parenting tip that harms your child. So please Remember that understanding reinforcement and reduction procedures is an important part of becoming a better, more consistent parent to your children. If you want to know more about these principles and how they can help you, come check out my no-cost workshop called How to Get Your Kids to Listen Without Raising Your Voice or Nagging. And it's available today at the Just 7 Steps website. Just go to just7steps.com/workshop for access to this free workshop today. And if someone is telling you that they were spanked or hit as a child and they turned out all right, I would counter this argument with, if you're advocating for unnecessarily hitting a child by his parents, then I would argue that you didn't turn out all that great. Instead of resorting to hitting or bad advice from people who've done a good job with their kids, go to just7steps.com/workshop and get a free, almost hour-long workshop from a parent, behavior analyst, and educator with more than 20 years of experience in the field, and learn how to get your kids to listen to you without raising your voice or nagging them. So if you like this video blog, I would love it if you would leave me a comment, give me a thumbs up, share the video with others who might also benefit, and subscribe to this channel for more awesome videos just like this one.